You're a Hoosier business and you've hired someone to work for you. You're not sure whether that person is an employee or an independent contractor. Do you need to pay unemployment insurance taxes for that individual? The agency here in Indiana that's in charge of making that determination is the Indiana Department of Workforce Development. It has a three-factor test called the ABC Employment Test, or the 1-2-3 Employment Test. The three factors are defined under the Indiana Code, Section 22-4-8-1. And each of these three factors need to be met for that person to be considered an independent contractor and not an employee. Factor 1. The person is an employee unless the individual has been and will continue to be free from control and direction in connection with the performance of such service, both under the individual's contract of service and in fact. Now that's a mouthful, but just like the IRS test that we've talked about previously and the test used by the Department of Labor, the key essential piece of this is control. The more control exerted by the business over the individual, the more likely that person is going to be considered an employee and not an independent contractor. If the business tells the person when, where, and how to do their job, it's more likely that person is an employee. If that person brings their own tools, sets their own hours, and is not subject to daily supervision, that person may very well be an independent contractor for purposes of this factor under the IDWD test. Factor 2. This factor looks to whether or not the person is providing the sort of services that are a regular part of the business for which they're working. For example, if the person is an art teacher and they're providing art classes in an art museum, that person very likely is an employee and not an independent contractor. On the other hand, if the person is a roofer and they're putting a roof on the art museum, that person is very likely an independent contractor for purposes of this test. Factor 3. A person is an employee unless the individual is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, profession, or business of the same nature as that involved in the service performed. This element examines whether the person is out on their own doing their own business. Do they have their own letterhead? Do they have their own business card? Do they do their own advertising? Do they pay their own unemployment insurance taxes? If they meet those sorts of factors, it's very likely that they have the sort of independence that's required for this factor under the ABC test. Now, unlike the IRS test and the test used by the Department of Labor, this isn't a weighing factor where you take these three factors and decide generally as the whole relationship. In order to meet the test for purposes of the Indiana Department of Workforce Development, all three of the factors need to be met for that person to be considered an independent contractor and not an employee. Now, it's very important that a business make this determination correctly, because if they don't, they can face tax liability and tax penalties. That's the test that's used by the Indiana Department of Workforce Development, sometimes called the ABC Employment Test or the 1-2-3 Employment Test. I'm Phil Zimmerly. Thanks for watching.